Record-setting mega fires scorched North America this summer. These fires released more greenhouse gases than most countries of the world. They burned thousands of homes and forced tens of thousands of people to evacuate. Harmful fire smoke covered continents. What a perfect time for a clear, down-to-earth fire manual for us all. It is called This is Wildfire: How to Protect Yourself, Your Home, and Your Community in the Age of Heat. The authors are Montana journalist and award-winning podcaster Nick Mott and fellow public radio broadcaster Professor Justin Angle. He is from the University of Montana. Their podcast and radio show is called Fireline. The new book is full of helpful tips with a message that will be controversial for some of you. From Missoula, Montana, Justin Angle, welcome to Radio Ecoshock.
Thank you. Good to be here with you.
Justin, your life is sort of complicated. You were a triathlon athlete in New England, then with a finance master's degree, a bond trader, and now?
My life has sort of had a few different distinct phases. I studied business as a college student and got into the bond markets, and then did a stint as a rowing coach because I was a rower as a student. That experience taught me that working on campus was something I wanted to do, so I went back to graduate school and earned a PhD and landed here as a business professor. Now, that still doesn't draw a clean line to why I was involved in Wildfire and a Wildfire book, but here in Missoula, Montana, we sit at an epicenter for wildfire science, fire management, fire fighting, and fire is part of this community, and much important work is being done here, and I wanted to understand it. And as I set out to try to understand it, it became clear that few citizens, in this area, but also in the country in general, had really an understanding of how we got to this place we're at with wildfire and how we move forward. And so the opportunity to collaborate with Nick on the Fireline podcast came about. That podcast was well received, and it led to this book opportunity. So not exactly a straight line to where I am today, but it's been a fun ride.
And you're in a good place now. Well, at Harvard, Professor Richard Wrangham suggested mastering fire could be essential to human evolution. How so?
Yeah, so Richard Wrangham, in his book, Chasing Fire, and, we came across Richard through his book and had the opportunity to interview him for Fireline, but he was one of the first anthropologists to propose the theory that the moment we became human was the moment that we learned how to control fire. And the mechanism through which that worked was by being able to control fire, we were able to cook our food. And cooking our food allowed for us to ingest the sort of calories we'd need to fuel a big brain, the big brain that modern human beings have. And so that basic evolutionary moment, or that basic moment of ingenuity by early primates, set in motion an evolutionary process that led to, what modern humans are today. And in some ways, it's kind of ironic that, our intent to control fire sort of also led to an obsession with burning that has done many things to contribute to climate change and the moment we're at with wildfire and other natural disasters that our planet's experiencing.
Your book contains chapters about how to make a home more fire-resistant and community organizing both before and after a fire. And speaking of that, intense and deadly fires are popping up in unexpected places like Greece and Hawaii. Justin, have we come to the point where every community and government needs a wildfire plan?
I think every community should have a wildfire plan. It's just a good exercise for a community to go through, to think about the critical risks, to think about its infrastructure, its policies, how safe its communities are as far as entry and exit and evacuation plans and so forth, and how fuels are managed in the community. Because to your point, yes, I think we're seeing fires in places that we haven't expected them. We're seeing them happen at times of the year where they have not historically happened, at least not in recent history. So we have a built environment that much of it has not been constructed with wildfire in mind. And I think the more communities that start considering wildfire, the stronger those communities will be when and if fire comes their way.
So you do cover climate change in fires, and we will get to that. But first you try to overcome a mass misunderstanding about the role of fire in western forests. What was the situation, say, in California before the European settlers arrived?
First of all, indigenous folks have been using fire and lived in conjunction with fire for millennia and managed wildfire. They didn't view it as, they viewed it as something to be respected as part of nature, as a gift in many ways, and they introduced fire onto the landscape. The historical record shows this. And they did it in a way that helped the ecosystem stay in balance. It helped them prepare their grounds for ceremony, but also for agriculture and rejuvenation. So there's been a long tradition of intentional burning on the landscape for long before European settlers were here. And natural fire was allowed to play a role on the landscape in a way that might seem unfamiliar to folks now. We hear of fire years that burn 10 million acres here in the U.S., and that's considered a giant fire year. And by recent standards, those are really large fire years. But before European settlement, parts of the West in particular, a 10 million acre fire year was not considered to be such a large number. It wasn't out of the ordinary. So, it's really the rise of fire suppression that has reduced the amount of fire on the landscape. And what we're living through now is kind of some of the consequence of putting out all that fire, because there's actually a deficit of fire in our system. And we can talk about that a little bit more if you'd like.
I'm sure we will get to that. That's a key point in the book. But could you just explain a bit more about indigenous fire management and what that might suggest for today?
Absolutely. So we had the great privilege of spending an afternoon with the late Tony Inkashola Sr. and his son, Tony Inkashola Jr., who are two members of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe, and they live north of Missoula on the Flathead Indian Reservation. Senior was long part of the Culture Committee, and Junior is in charge of fire management for the tribes. And they described some of that history, and they did so by taking us to this particular place called the Jocko Prairie. It's an area, a riparian area. It's sort of in the foothills of some large mountains adjacent to some really dense, lush forest. And for many, many years, this land was fire was excluded from this landscape. Kind of the European standard of suppressing all fires was the standard on this piece of land. And the land had become quite unhealthy, unappealing, choked with debris. Cattle were grazing on that land, so that was another factor that led to it being out of balance. And historically, the tribe had used fire and had lived in conjunction with fire. It was not viewed as something to be afraid of, and it was not viewed as something to be put out. And so elders in the tribe advocated to reintroduce fire to the landscape. And it was a long process to try to do that. And what I mean by introducing fire to the landscape, it's sort of the intentional introduction of fire, so setting fire intentionally. And, and we can get into the mechanics of that. But in terms of this particular piece of land, they get buy-in from the tribes, buy-in from the community, and introduced a prescribed burn, a low-intensity burn that cleared out a lot of the underbrush, a lot of the trees that were being overshadowed by larger trees. And the forest quickly became much more healthy. The larger trees that withstood the fire, they had been adapted to withstand fire. Large ponderosas, for example, they became more healthy. The understory became easier to move through, much more in balance.
Well, let's move to climate and the fires that we're seeing. Does science show that wildfires are increasing in the United States, say even since 1980? And has the nature of those fires changed as well?
Yeah, so the first thing is we got to think about how we measure fire. So in terms of acres burned, the number of acres burned has been growing over the last 10 to 15 years, and there's some variation in there. The number of fire starts has not changed in a meaningful way over the last 20 years. We're experiencing about the same number of fire starts on an annual basis. Fires are getting more destructive, though, so the fires that do escape suppression efforts grow larger and burn hotter and can spread more quickly than they used to be. Fire seasons are longer. Fire season now is about 80 days longer than it was 30 years ago. And rather than calling it a fire season, we might just call it a fire year. One of the most devastating wildfires in the United States happened over New Year's, essentially, the Marshall Fire outside of Boulder, Colorado. So, yeah, we're experiencing fires at different times of the year. The fires are more intense and they're more destructive. And one of the key reasons they're more destructive, and this is important to keep in mind, is that we've built more and more homes and more structures in places that are prone to burning. So, it's not that these places are burning in unprecedented ways necessarily. It's just that we've happened to build a lot of our homes in these places, and that's the primary cause of the destruction rather than the fire itself, if you think about it from that perspective. But yeah, there's a few different dimensions to how to quantify fire. Acres burned is not necessarily the best dimension, but on several measures, the intensity and overall volume of fires has certainly increased.
And do we have the science to directly link some of those changes to climate change, to heating the planet with burning fossil fuels?
Yeah, the science has a pretty simple intuition, and that intuition is the warmer the temperature, the more fires we have. We talked to a climate scientist at Montana State University, Kathy Whitlock, and she explained one of the methods that her and her colleagues used to document this relationship. And so they drilled down into the bottom of lakes and pull out these long tubes that are called sediment cores. So by looking at a sample of the sediment at the bottom of the lake, it's like an historical record of the climate. And you can see, based on the pollens that they detect, what sorts of plants were growing. And if you know what sort of plants are growing, you know what kind of temperature range was happening. And if you know the temperature range, you also see evidence of fire in this core when you see, different patterns of charcoal. The science shows that the warmer the temperatures on the planet, the more fires we have. That's the simple intuition. One of the reasons that plays out is this concept called vapor pressure deficit. So when the air is hotter, when the temperature is higher, more moisture is drawn out of the system. Vegetation is drier. There's both the vegetation that's living and also the vegetation that has, is dead on the ground. All of that is fuel. And if the fuel is drier, if conditions are warmer, then you're going to have more fire. In fact, Kathy and her colleagues told us that we're actually in what's called a fire deficit. That based on the temperatures that we're experiencing, we should actually have more fire than we have now. And we can talk about why we don't, but that's just something that listeners should be aware of, is based on, the warming that we're experiencing, that we should expect more fire to be in the system.
With every big season, social media and even mainstream media blare about arsonists setting fire, but most of the fires, at least here in Canada, almost 99 out of 100, were started by lightning storms, not arson. So you looked into why humans dwell on simplistic explanations. Why is the arsonist conspiracy so popular, and is it a kind of fire or climate denial?
Oh, man, I don't know if it's necessarily fire or climate denial. It's climate denial in the sense that, if people say that arson is becoming, more rampant, that can excuse us from thinking that the climate is driving any of the increase in fires. I think the arson, whether you want to classify it as a conspiracy or an explanation or the sort of obsession and attention that arson gets, because it provides us with an easy culprit, right? If we can blame the actions of a single person as one bad actor, we don't then have to consider the broader instability in our system. And if we think of arsons as the proximal cause of our fire problem, we just need to lock up all the arsonists, right? And that's kind of simple thought process. But if we have to think about like, whoa, the climate's changed and we've built our homes in places they maybe shouldn't be built, and we've built with materials and designs and constructed our neighborhoods in risky ways, those are much bigger sort of look in the mirror type of problems that are much harder to address with solutions.
Right. Well, a central theme in This is Wildfire is bound to be controversial. You argue, with some science to back it up, that we should fight fire with fire. What is a prescribed burn association?
A prescribed burn association is something that we're seeing more of across the West and southwestern United States and some areas in the middle parts of the continent as well. It's a collection of local landowners that want to introduce fire onto their land. And it's not uncommon for private landowners to, have slash piles and burn those piles. It's a pretty common thing, at least here in Montana, and certainly other places I've traveled to. But doing it at a scale that manages the level of fuel on the landscape, that tries to return a forest to some balance, that tries to simulate the role that periodic wildfire historically played on the landscape, doing that at a scale where it has an impact on the health of an ecosystem is difficult. And it takes coordination, it takes training, it takes management. It's a hard thing for any one landowner to do, both pragmatically and in terms of the regulations and so forth. The agencies, at least here in the States, say they want to introduce more prescribed burning on federal and state lands. That's really hard to do. And the only agency that's been able to increase its burning has been the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So an alternative model that's arisen are these prescribed burning associations, which are, like I said, these localized organizations that are trying to do this at a scale that can affect their local ecosystems. And it's a pretty successful model. I mean, we don't want any individual landowners just going out and setting fire to their property without the right resources, training, and safety measures put in place. And so these associations are a mechanism that seems promising as a way to introduce more fire onto the landscape and allow fire to play more of its natural role in the ecosystem.
But this sets up a basic paradox. A few years back, we had Swiss scientist Thomas Crowther on Radio Ecoshock, and he explained planting billions of trees could reduce overall global warming. And some countries are planting trees on a massive scale. But is that offset by more purposeful burning in North America? Why plant trees in some places and burn trees in others?
I mean, that's a complicated question, and there's a lot of competing interests. Yes, fire releases carbon into the atmosphere, and wildfire smoke can be a big contributor to greenhouse gases. Or wildfire smoke, it is a greenhouse gas. There needs to be balance. The cause of climate change, in many ways, is not wildfire smoke. It's industrialized burning. It's the cars and factories and other sources of carbon. I think those are probably the sorts of emissions that we should be thinking about more than how to limit wildfire smoke. Because if we plant, or just allow forests to be overgrown, that's potential energy in the system. As we saw with the Northern Canadian fires this summer, like once those fires get going in those dense forests, it's near impossible to suppress. So if we're thinking about planting trees to create carbon offsets, that's a useful mechanism, right? I'm not against trees, but I do think we need to consider the potential risks that introduces to a system. Are those forests healthy? Are they resilient to burning? Are they planted solely for the purpose of offsetting carbon and not with some sort of natural order in mind? Meaning, are they too dense, maybe too risky as far as the potential for wildfire? Like if a wildfire comes to one of those specifically planted forests, is it natural enough to be resilient to fire on its own, or are we going to be able to manage a fire in that area if it ever arises? These are hard trade-offs. Without clear answers one way or the other.
Oh, no doubt our listeners would like to hear how they could make their own homes and communities less likely to burn down. What are your top tips, Justin Angle?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can do to make our homes more resilient to wildfire. And I think the first step in that process is for folks to understand what's the most likely way their house could catch fire. Often in the media, we see portrayals of huge flames overtaking a home. And that's rarely the way that a home ignites. There's research by a retired Forest Service scientist named Jack Cohen, and he was a pioneer of understanding that the biggest risk to a home is actually a floating ember, and that ember can be wafted from a fire, up to miles away. And that embers tend to find weak spots on your home. That weak spot could be some debris in a gutter. It could be some leaves in a little crevice on your roof. It could be a wooden roof. It could be firewood or scrap wood stacked up under a deck. It could be anything that's flammable that's touching your house. These embers find weak spots, and then your home ignites. If you conceptualize your home as fuel for a fire, then it helps you think about ways to make it more resilient. Cleaning those gutters, getting any vegetation back from the home, surrounding the home maybe with gravel instead of mulch. If you have a wooden roof, be thinking about ways to get rid of that. That is a big expense for many, and I think here in the States, and I'm not sure how it works in Canada, but I think some public investment to help people with wooden roofs replace those roofs, particularly if they're at high-risk zones, is worth consideration. But thinking of your home and the immediate area around it as the space you need to defend and make it more resilient to wildfire, that can go a long way to protect a home. A lot of folks saw images from the fire in Lahaina in Maui. I got questions often about the so-called miracle home there and why one home was able to survive when everything around it was just burned to the ground. And, there's probably a measure of luck involved in the survival of that home. But if you look at the pictures of that home, you'll immediately notice that it has a rather new-looking metal roof. It's a metal roof that was installed in 2021. You'll also notice that there's no vegetation immediately touching the home or within several feet of it. And there's gravel landscaping around that home. So that home had a lot of defenses built into it. And those defenses probably contributed to its survival. So the key insight there is there's things you can do to harden your home. And there's resources like wildfirerisk.org or firewise.org that outline a lot of the specifics. We outline the specifics in our book.
You're listening to Ecoshock Radio for the world.
I'm Alex Smith. Get it all at our website, ecoshock.org. You are listening to Radio Ecoshock. I'm Alex Smith from the University of Montana. Our guest is Dr. Justin Angle, co-author of the new book, This is Wildfire. At last count, 42% of Montana's electricity was generated by coal. You and Nick Mott don't pull any punch on climate's role in pushing wildfires. How does your program go over in a conservative state and on public radio there?
That's a tough one. In Montana, the coal industry is strong here, and not only is the industry strong, but we've built our energy systems around fossil fuels. However, we are seeing a rise in green energy investment. We've got a long tradition of hydropower here in the state of Montana, and that's a form of a renewable. I'm not necessarily a dam advocate, but that is a less carbon-intensive source of energy. We're seeing investment in solar, investment in wind, particularly as we electrify here. I see more and more electric vehicles around. Cheaper, cleaner, more scalable sources of electricity are going to be in demand, particularly as landowners in the West. The pressure on working private lands in the West is intense, and if there's ways that the owners of those working lands can monetize their lands in new ways, maybe through solar and wind, that those are ways that those landowners might become more open to sources of clean energy. It's a hard problem to solve here in Montana and other western states in the U.S.
Well, as we wrap up, my favorite two parts of your book are the inside scoop on who firefighters are and how they think, plus a handy dictionary of fire lingo. But we should close with your bottom line. What do you hope listeners will take home from your new book about wildfire?
I think there's two things. I think first is we should open our minds up to more fire at more times of the year. Our system is out of balance. Fire has been excluded from our forests. We've built a system that's dedicated to putting out as many fires as possible. And we need our agencies to have license to do more prescribed burning at safe times of the year with enough resources to make them safe. I think the public needs to be more open to that as a solution. The other thing is that we need to not only take responsibility for making our homes, our individual homes, more resilient to fire, but we need to be good neighbors and help our neighbors and community members adopt a similar mentality. And we need to really think long and hard about how we build and where we build. Zoning and codes are tremendously fraught topics here in the American West, but they're topics that need to be addressed. And we're starting to see some of that public process be taken out of our hands by, insurance companies and the mortgage industry to some respects. But, thinking hard about how we build and where we build is important.
From Montana, we've been speaking with Dr. Justin Angle, with his co-author and award-winning co-podcaster Nick Mott. They just released a great manual for the new age of fire. Look for This is Wildfire, How to Protect Yourself, Your Home, and Your Community in the Age of Heat. You can find more links about the book and more in my weekly show blog at ecoshock.org. Justin Angle, thank you for joining us on Radio Ecoshock.
Alex, thanks so much, and thanks to all your listeners. I really appreciate the conversation and the thoughtful questions.
I'm Alex Smith reporting.
Check out the Radio Ecoshock website. We're at ecoshock.org.